Were the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a good thing? I know, that question probably made you a bit uncomfortable, and it should. We're talking about weapons that vaporized tens of thousands of people in an instant. Weapons that left shadows burned into concrete where human beings once stood. But here's the thing about history. Sometimes the most important questions are the ones that make us squirm. And today, I want to explore an argument you probably haven't heard before, or at least probably not the reasoning. One that suggests these horrific weapons might have prevented something even worse. So, let's dive into one of the most controversial questions in modern history. Let's start with the obvious argument, the one most of us instinctively make when we think about August 6th and 9th of 1945. The numbers are staggering. Between 110,000 and 150,000 people were killed either instantly or died within the first few weeks following the atomic bombs. But that's just the beginning of the horror. Hundreds of thousands more would die in the following decades from radiation sickness, cancer, and other long-term effects of exposure. We're talking about children who developed leukemia years later, adults who suffered from radiation-induced illness for the rest of their lives, entire families wiped out in a flash of light hotter than the surface of the sun. These weren't just soldiers, they were civilians, mothers, fathers, children going about their daily lives. A streetcar conductor frozen mid-route, a child reaching for their parent, all of them gone in an instant, or condemned to slow, agonizing deaths from radiation poisoning. The human cost is almost incomprehensible, and from this perspective, the use of these weapons represents one of the darkest moments in human history, a line we crossed that can never be uncrossed. That's the emotional, visceral argument, and it's powerful because it's true. But history is rarely that simple. Now let's take a look at the counter-argument, the one you've probably heard before, even if you don't agree with it. By August of 1945, Japan was losing the war. That much was clear. The Allies would have won eventually, with or without the atomic bombs. But the key word there is eventually. Military planners estimated the war could have dragged on for another year or more, and the Japanese military had shown absolutely no willingness to surrender yet. They were preparing for a final, desperate defense of the home islands. The planned invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall, would have been the largest amphibious assault in human history, and the projected casualties were absolutely horrifying. Estimates for Allied deaths ranged from 100,000 to over 1 million. That's American, British, Australian, and other Allied soldiers who would have died storming Japanese beaches. But the Japanese casualties would have been far worse. Military planners projected between 5 and 10 million Japanese deaths. Not just soldiers, but civilians as well. The Japanese government was training civilians, including women and children, to fight with bamboo spears and improvised weapons. So, here's the grim calculus. 110,000 to 150,000 deaths from the atomic bombs versus potentially millions from a prolonged invasion and conventional bombing campaign. From this perspective, as horrific as the atomic bombs were, they were the lesser evil. They ended the war quickly and, paradoxically, saved more lives than they took. That's the traditional argument for the bombings, and it's compelling. But I want to propose a different argument entirely. One that has nothing to do with World War II casualty counts. What if the real consequence of using or not using the atomic bombs had nothing to do with ending World War II? What if the true impact was about what came next? Because here's what most people don't talk about. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki might have saved tens of millions of lives, maybe even prevented the end of human civilization as we know it. Not in 1945, but in the decades that followed. Let me explain. During World War II, the Soviet Union had spies embedded deep within the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, and others were feeding information about America's atomic bomb program directly to Moscow. So, here's the thing. Stalin knew about the atomic bomb before it was ever used. He had detailed intelligence reports sitting on his desk describing the weapon's design and theoretical capabilities. But Stalin didn't believe them, or, more accurately, he didn't believe the bombs were as powerful as the reports claimed. Remember, this was a man who had survived the most brutal conflict in human history, the Eastern Front, where millions died in conventional warfare. He'd seen cities reduced to rubble by artillery and firebombing. When his spies told him about a single bomb that could destroy an entire city, Stalin was skeptical. It sounded like propaganda. Like American exaggeration. After all, he'd never seen anything like it. And then, Hiroshima happened. On August 6th, 1945, the world changed. And more importantly, Stalin's understanding of what was possible changed. The reports coming out of Japan weren't propaganda. They were undeniable. A single bomb had obliterated an entire city. The photographs, the casualty counts, the sheer scale of destruction. It was all real. 3 days later, Nagasaki confirmed it wasn't a fluke. Stalin immediately ordered the Soviet Union to develop its own atomic weapons, not as a side project, but as an absolute priority, because he had seen, with his own eyes, what these weapons could do. Now, let's imagine a different timeline, a world where the atomic bombs were never used on Japan. In this alternate history, World War II still ends, maybe it takes another year, maybe Operation Downfall happens, maybe Japan surrenders after continued conventional bombing and Soviet invasion from the north. Either way, the war ends. But here's the critical difference. Stalin never sees what atomic weapons can actually do. Sure, his spies are still sending reports, American scientists are still conducting tests in the desert, but without the visceral, undeniable proof of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, these weapons remain theoretical to Soviet leadership. Stalin might still pursue atomic weapons eventually. After all, if America has them, the Soviet Union needs them too. But the urgency is different. The understanding is different. Most importantly, the respect for what these weapons can do is completely absent. Here's where things get really dangerous. In our actual timeline, the United States used 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Why 2? Because that's all that they had ready to use. The Manhattan Project had produced exactly 3 bombs. 1 for the Trinity test, and 2 that got used on Japan. But by that time, the Cold War heated up. Both superpowers weren't dealing with 2 bombs. They were dealing with dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. In our real timeline, both American and Soviet leaders had seen what just one of these weapons could do to a city. They had seen photographs. They understood the human cost. That knowledge, that visceral understanding, created a baseline of fear and respect. But in our alternate timeline, the one where Hiroshima and Nagasaki never happened, leaders on both sides may have hundreds or even thousands of weapons they'd never seen used in anger. Weapons whose true destructive power was theoretical, abstract, just numbers on a page and calculations from scientists. And here's the terrifying part. Humans are really bad at understanding abstract threats. Let's talk about the moments when the world came closest to nuclear war. The Berlin blockade in 1948, the Korean War in 1950, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, Able Archer in 1983. In each of these moments, leaders on both sides had to make decisions about whether to escalate or back down. And in our real timeline, they backed down. Because they knew what nuclear weapons could do. Not theoretically, actually. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were burned into the collective consciousness of world leadership. When Kennedy and Khrushchev stared each other down during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both men understood that nuclear war didn't just mean military casualties. It meant cities full of civilians vaporized. It meant children dying from radiation sickness. It meant a level of horror that had been documented and photographed and was impossible to ignore. But in our alternate timeline, without that demonstration, imagine a Soviet or American general in 1962 trying to convince their leadership to back down from a confrontation. In our timeline, they could point to Hiroshima. They could say, this is what will happen to Moscow, or this is what will happen to New York. But without that reference point, nuclear weapons are just bigger bombs, more efficient. The difference between them and conventional weapons seems like a matter of degree, not kind. And that's when people make catastrophic mistakes. So let's follow this alternate timeline to its logical conclusion. It's 1962, or 1973, or 1983. Tensions between the superpowers have reached a breaking point, and without the visceral understanding of what nuclear weapons actually do, a leader makes the decision to use them. But remember, this isn't 1945 with 2 bombs. This is the Cold War with hundreds or even thousands of warheads. The first strike hits. Maybe it's a limited strike, just military targets. But the other side retaliates. And suddenly, you have a cascade of escalation that nobody fully understood the consequences of when they started it. Within hours, dozens of cities are gone. Not just military casualties, tens of millions of civilians dead. The infrastructure of entire nations destroyed, and depending on how far it escalates, you're looking at potential for a nuclear winter, global famine, or even the collapse of civilization. In the worst-case scenario, we're talking about the end of the world as we know it. Not necessarily because the leaders were evil, but because they didn't truly understand what they were unleashing. So, let's come back to our original question. Were the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a good thing? The answer is still horrifying, because we're not talking about good in any normal sense of the word. We're talking about a lesser evil. 110,000 to 150,000 people died in those bombings, with hundreds of thousands more suffering in the decades that followed. That's not good. That's a tragedy of almost incomprehensible scale. But here's the paradox. Those deaths might have saved tens of millions of lives, maybe even hundreds of millions, possibly even all of us. Because the world needed to see what nuclear weapons could do. Not in a test range in the desert, but in a real city with real people. As horrible as that sounds, the demonstration created a baseline of understanding that may have prevented something far worse during the Cold War. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became a warning, a line that, once crossed, showed humanity exactly where that path led. And for 75 years, no nuclear weapon has been used in anger since. Is that because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? We can't prove that for certain. History doesn't give us control groups. We can't run the experiment again without the bombings and see what happens. But we can look at the moments when leaders chose not to use nuclear weapons, and we can see that the memory of those two cities played a role in these decisions. This is an uncomfortable argument, and it should be. We're talking about justifying the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people as a means to an end. And maybe you disagree with this reasoning. Maybe you think there were other ways to demonstrate nuclear weapons' power without using them on cities. Maybe you think the traditional arguments about ending World War II are more compelling. Or maybe you think no justification is possible for what happened in August of 1945. That's okay. These are the kinds of historical questions that don't have easy answers. But I think they're worth wrestling with, because understanding the past, even the darkest parts of it, is how we try to build a better future. So, I want to hear from you. Do you think the atomic bombings were justified? Do you buy this argument about nuclear deterrence? Or is there a line that should never be crossed, regardless of consequences? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a respectful discussion about one of history's most difficult questions. Thank you for watching, and remember, the goal isn't to have all the answers, it's to ask better questions.